Hey guys, welcome back to our 21st Farming RPG tutorial. So today we're going to continue on with our dialogue system and extend it so that we can have our NPCs using unique dialogue, unique names, portraits, voices, and all of that. So we want to get them displaying all of their correct attributes when we are actually going up and talking to them. Now, first thing that I want to do is just last time we created that OBJ text box and we set up some initial default values just to test that it was working, and we just dropped it into this room. So now that we're going to be moving on today, I'm just going to delete this before I forget and just remove it from that room because we don't need to test it anymore. So here we are, we're back at the OBJ text box in its create event, and let's just scroll down and have a think. So all of these variables, so the variables that we set up for the sprites that we were using, the positions, the heights and widths of all of our elements, obviously all of those are going to stay constant no matter who is talking. We don't need to change any of those variables, but the variables we do need to change are these. So the text, the name, the voice, and this portrait index. So remember that portrait index was just corresponding to the frame of our portrait's sprite that we want to set to represent a certain character. So this character right here is frame number 3, 0, 1, 2, 3, and we want to display that one when a certain character is talking. Alright, so we want all of our NPCs to have their own portraits, text, names, and voices. So we're going to need to set up these variables in them and then pass it on to the text box when we go up and interact with them. So again, just to clean up a little bit of what we were doing before, I'm just going to delete those test lines so that we only have one. The rest is fine. We can change all of that later, but let's come into the NPC object. So in characters, parent NPC, and we'll just we'll initialize the variables that we will overwrite in the NPCs themselves, but we'll just, to get an idea, set them up here. Also later on, we might separate NPCs from just characters, so we might have non-talking NPCs and we'll want to separate this from them, but for now this is fine. So like I said, we're going to want to have an NPC's own portrait index, and I'm going to leave this at 0. Their own voice. I had a few voices, I'm just going to leave it at that one. And a name. And so if we're keeping it generic, you might want to put something like anonymous. And I should point out, if you're putting in one line of text, you might be tempted to just put something like that. But remember that text in our text box is going to be treated as an array, whereas here it's just a variable. So even if you do just want one line, you have to remember to set that as an entry in a text array. Or a different way to do this is to initialize it like that. And I might just put here, this person has nothing to say, as the generic pop-up for an anonymous person. Now there is one more thing that I'm going to add, and that is speakers. And now this is going to be who is saying what line. So if, for example, this first line is whatever the object that is running this, then I want it to be the first speaker. So I would put its own ID. But if the player was going to go and say the next line, then I would put OBJ player, and I might have a back and forth. So I might go this object's ID, then the player, then the object again, and then the player again, or different characters. You would just put whoever is speaking what line, because that is how we are going to let the text box know whose portrait, whose voice, whose name should be associated with a particular line of text. So just as the default, I'm going to keep that just as ID. It's going to be an array, obviously, unlike these here, which is sort of just fixed attributes of an object. These are the things that we're going to have to be passing to the text box. All right, great. So let's just copy this. And we want to be putting this in all of our people. So we do have to remember to set up the players one because I want my player to be able to interact with dialogue too. So just as an example, I'll go through the player with you, but then you can set up your own NPCs. So for the portrait index, if you remember how my character looks, I'm just going to match it up to this portrait here. So that would be 0, 1, 2. So that's her portrait index. You might have some more elaborate sprites for your project, that's totally fine. Number 2, I might just keep her voice as voice 1. I'm going to change the name to be player. We might change that later, but that's fine. So the player doesn't need text or a speakers variable because it is never going to be having a conversation with itself. I don't ever want to be triggering a dialogue event with the player, so I'm not going to put those here, but we do need these in the NPCs. So just go ahead and make up some attributes and some lines for your NPCs. Maybe have some that's over multiple lines just to change it up a little bit and test if it works when there is an actual conversation. Yeah, and I will do that now. Alright, so that is me done. Now, we've created all of the attributes for all of our NPCs, but we have to be able to pass them along in the event that our player goes up and interacts with them. So let's come to the player and we're going to create a collision event. So we're going to add to these inputs, input, interact, keyboard check pressed, and make sure you put pressed here because we don't want to be creating multiple text boxes as we keep the keyboard pressed down or something. And we don't want to be recreating the text box as soon as we delete it because we're still pressing the button down. I've made that mistake a few times, so just make sure that you put pressed. Alright, so if we press that input interact button, and let's just scroll down to our collisions with objects, and I'm going to make a new section here, text box, and we're going to check if we have hit that input interact button. If we press that button, then I'm going to check if there is an NPC in our vicinity. And we're going to do that with a collision check. But I don't want it to be a straight up place meeting. I want to kind of have a little radius or a box around the player, a little area that we're going to check if an NPC is within that area. So I'm going to use the function collision rectangle. And this basically just checks to see if a specific object is within a certain rectangle. So if you imagine the player at the center of a rectangle, or a square more like, it's going to check to see if there is a NPC close to it. So it wants the upper left and then the bottom right coordinates of our box. And what I'm going to do is, so centering on the player's XY position, I'm going to have a certain radius go a certain amount over and a certain amount up, and that's going to be the top left, and the same amount right and the same amount down. So just creating a box. So I'm going to call this a radius. Obviously, it's not the same as the radius for a circle. It's more like a half width, and you can call it that if you want, but radius just makes more sense to me. I'm going to set that to 16. So it's pretty small. You might want to play with this variable. And we're going to go x minus radius, y minus radius. That's the top left, so over and up. And then the x plus radius and y plus radius. And now we have to give it the object that we're going to check for a collision with. And this is going to be parent NPC. And this is another reason not to have the player as part of the NPC parent, because we don't want to check with a collision with ourselves. Although there is an option to say, don't include me in this little calculation. It's asking if you want a precise collision, which just means are we checking pixel by pixel, or are we going to check a collision box that we set up, I think, way back in our collisions video. So I'm just going to put false. We don't need precise collisions. And not me, it doesn't even really matter because players isn't going to be taken into account anyway, but I'll just put false. So what this does, similar to the other collision functions like instance place, it will return the ID of an instance if it finds it within this radius. So if it finds a child of parent NPC within this radius, it's going to give us its ID, which is exactly what we want because we want to have it create a text box with its appropriate variable. So with its own text, with its own portrait, and so on. We're going to save it in a local variable. And now we're just going to check if inst does not equal no one. So we have found that inst does equal someone, right? There has been a collision. There is an NPC that we want to interact with, that we want to create a text box. Then we're going to go ahead now and create that text box. I'm actually going to do that via a script because I just think it's neater if we put this into a little script. And we're just going to call this create text box. So obviously we haven't made it yet, but let's go ahead and do that. Create text box. And now is when we're going to have to create the text box and then change some of those variables of the text box. So let's just set up those descriptor things for the script to help us out when we're using it. So description, create text box, and now the arguments that we're going to pass in. So at the moment, we're going to pass in just 2 arguments, right? So we're going to pass in the text, and we're also going to pass in the speakers. And we don't have to pass it anything else, because it will know from who is talking, just from the speakers, to go and grab the appropriate names, portraits, and voices for each line. And it's going to make more sense in a minute, so just stay with me. So the first thing we need to do is just create the text box, right? So let's just go instance, create layer, 0, 0, right? It doesn't really matter where you create the text box, but this is the convention for objects like that. So just at the top left of the room, in the text layer, so not in the instances layer, we're going to put it in that layer that we set up in this room, text, because that way it's going to be on top of all of our instances. And the object is a text box, but not just any old default text box. We want to change some of its variables now. So again, we're going to have to use a with statement. Actually, we want to save this in a variable so we can go with it. And then at the very bottom, we're actually going to return this text box's ID. And we're going to do that for a problem that's going to come up later. And it's basically just so the player can manage when to create a text box, because we don't want to create the same text box multiple times if we have a text box already running. And the way that we're going to do that is to sort of save its ID and check if it exists or not. So that's for later on. Don't worry about that right now. So in here, so we've created the text box and now we're going to go with it and we're going to change some variables. So we're going to firstly set text equal to this argument here. So argument 0. And then we're going to set speakers equal to argument 1. And just keep in mind that speakers doesn't actually exist in the text box yet. That wasn't a variable that we set up in the text box. Doesn't really matter because it is going to be setting this up as soon as it gets created by this script. So we don't need to set an initial variable. You might want to do that just to keep track of all the variables that should be in the text box, but we don't need to. And now what we're going to do is actually look at the text, loop through it, and then for every line of text, check who the speaker is, and then save its name, portrait index, and voice into that line so that we know that line is going to be associated with that speaker. So we want to save its name, portrait, and voice. So let's go ahead and do that. So firstly, we have to get the length of the text. We could also get the length of the speakers. It should be the exact same thing, but it doesn't matter. You can put either. And then we're going to use a repeat statement, or you could use a for loop. We're going to set up that initial I variable. It's going to be incrementing every repeat. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to create a bunch of other variables now as well. So if you'll recall, in the text box object, we have name, voice, and portrait index, and that is what we use in the draw event here. So portrait index, name, and voice to draw the portrait, the name, and to play the sound effect. So those are the variables that we'll have to end up changing to get it working. So these are not arrays at the moment. So that name, portrait index, and voice, that is just the name, portrait index, and voice for that page of dialogue. But we're going to create a larger array that's going to store all the names for all the pages, all the portrait indexes, and all the voices. So we're going to go names. Right, so this doesn't exist. We don't have a variable called names in the text box yet. Names, the first entry of names is going to be the first speaker's name. So whoever is speaking first, we're going to put its name in the names array first. I'm going to do the same for portrait indexes, except I'm just going to write portraits. So we're going to get the speaker's portrait index for whatever I currently is. So on the first loop, this is just the first one. And then voices. Right, and so it's going to go through every line of text and save all of those variables. Now, in the text box, we had this important event that's going to run at the start of every page update. So whenever we go to the next page, we want to run this event so that it sort of organizes all of our text, it wraps it, and then it returns the wrapped text. And in here is also where we can update those singular variables, the name variable, the singular name variable, the voice, and the portrait index for that page. So what we can do is go and set it to, so set name to grab the name entry in our names array for that page, right? And we do the same for voice. Grab it from the voices and the portrait index we grab from the portraits array. And if you remember, we actually had this running at the very start. We don't need this anymore because that would just be wrapping this text, but we don't need to do that. What we do want to do though is wrap it after this text is set up, because the create event of an object is actually run immediately after you create it. So it's going to first go through all of its create event and then it's going to run this. So it will have finished all of its setup by the time we get to here. We're returning its ID. We can come back to the player object now. So the only thing we have to do now is just input those arguments into here. Now, keep in mind that at the moment, the player is the one that's running this, but we want to be getting the text and the speakers of a particular NPC. So they all have their own dialogue events. They all have their own text and speakers. So we want them to be inputting this stuff. So we actually want the NPC to be running this and inputting those variables. So now that should work. Let's give it a test. There are some things we're gonna have to fix up, but you should get into the habit of testing things as often as you can. So let's come up and talk to someone. Awesome, so we can see the portrait has carried over, her name has carried over, and we've got her text. And the next line that had that different speaker, which was actually us, is coming up as well. But, so something that's gonna happen is, if I am still standing next to her and then I close the text box, it's not sort of ending properly. Well, for one, she was walking away everywhere. We might want to stop her from moving when we talk to her, but we didn't put anything preventing multiple text boxes being created. But we do want to do that. And that's why we were getting that doubling up. It was just because there were actually multiple text boxes there. So I'm going to actually create a variable called active text box. And because we set up our script to return the ID of the text box, we can actually set it to this. So I'm going to create active text box. It's going to be equal to no one by default. And before we do any of this, we want to just check that active text box is still equal to no one. And only then do we want to go ahead and create a text box. So let's check. If active text box equals no one, then I will create a text box. And then after we create it, we want to set active text box equal to this. And you might be tempted to write it in here, but remember we're in a with statement here. We can't actually access this. So we could either go other dot active text box, or we could just save it in a local variable here and then set active text box equal to tbox. Now, how is active text box going to get reset? Because it's the deleting of the text box is separate from our player, it's possible for the text box to delete itself only to have the player recreate it in the same frame, which is not what we want. So I'm going to put a case in here. So if we have created a text box, right, we've saved an ID in here and it's going to be some jumble of numbers, then even if it's been destroyed, this is still not going to be true because it's still going to be equal to a jumble of numbers. It's not going to be equal to no one because no one's actually -4. So it's not going to be -4. So this is going to run. And here we can check if the active text box instance does not exist anymore, then we can set it back to be no one. And because we have separated the creating and the resetting in an if-else statement, they're never going to run both at the same time. So this is going to give us that one frame window that we need. Now, for our other problem where we have the NPCs running around after we are having a conversation with them, if we want to prevent that, let's come over to them and I'm going to create a variable and I might put it here, can move, and I'm going to set that as true to start off with, because obviously we do want them to be free to move at the start, but if it's false. If can move is not true, so if not can move, then I'm just going to exit the entire step event. So it's not going to run any of that because we don't need to be updating movement. But move X and move Y are still going to be updated in this alarm that keeps going off, which is going to influence how it's drawing itself. So we actually want to just freeze it in place. We don't want it like changing on the spot, even if it isn't moving. So it still might change direction every few seconds. So to prevent that, we want it to not do this. So we want it to only do this if can move is true. But I will still allow it to keep the alarm going off because it can just periodically check back in, and eventually when the text box doesn't exist anymore, this will run in a case where we can move again and it will start moving. Alright, great. Come back to the player and we just need to set can move in here, so right in the NPC, as false. And I'll just set its move X and move Y to be 0, so just stopping it from moving from whatever it was set to from the previous alarm. But one more thing we have to do, of course, is reset can move to be true when the text box gets destroyed. So I'm just going to come into the destroy event of the text box, go with parent NPC, and set can move to be true. Now this is going to go with every single NPC and set all of it to true, which is a little bit unnecessary, but it will do the job for now, because I'm actually probably going to just change this later on, because we might actually end up freezing the entire world when we're in a dialogue, so I might not want anything to move. Certainly, it might depend on your game how you want to do that, but there's just not enough time in this video to go over something like that, so that's just a little band-aid for that. Everything should be working now, so let's test it. Alright, let's come over to him. Great, so he stops moving to talk to us, and so enough time has passed for the alarm to go off, but he still isn't moving. Great. And if we just wait a while, he resumes moving. Okay, awesome. So there we go. So we've finished our brief little bit on dialogue. There's still more to be done in this system because we might want the NPCs to be saying different things at different times or in different rooms. For now, I still want to expand the dialogue a little bit, and we're actually going to be including some systems from my other videos like the cutscenes and the camera, and I'll actually be directing you to watch those videos and create the objects and systems yourselves and to put them into this project. And in the coming tutorials at some point, I will guide you in integrating them, and we're going to set up some interactions with the dialogue and the NPCs and the camera to be able to work with the camera and the cutscenes. But for now, we are done. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you next time. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's supporting me on Patreon to make these tutorials. And special shoutouts to Semimyth, Bartholomew Lisfon, Cursed Toast, Danielle Hargrave, Doen Tekben, Vasco, XD Game Studio, Umberto Gonzalez, Hunter T, Ian Seckington, Shake Bunny, The Great Poultry, Thomas M, Max Molnaro, Monju72, Moo Podcasts, Mistara, Ricky C, Straya Moon, Spock 2018, and Semi-Metal Alchemist. I hope you guys are all well, and I will see you in the next video.